There are disaster zones all around our planet.
The first thing you see is devastation, wreckage, ruined buildings, torn up highways.
It's actually very unnerving. It's almost like there's some otherworldly movement going on underneath there. It doesn't in any way feel normal.
Some were struck by unexpected forces. Others were the victims of human ambition.
I mean, what's actually happening here is quite frightening, and it's unprecedented in terms of anywhere else on the Earth's surface.
It looks like a post-apocalyptic landscape. You have to wonder, was it bombed? Did anyone survive? What happened here?
Destroyed by Mother Nature, fatal miscalculations, or bizarre phenomena. These are 5 of the world's strangest disaster zones.
There was an entire town there that's now gone.
Crumbling remains, ruins of lost worlds, shaped by extraordinary events, violent forces, and human ambitions. Their secrets waiting to be revealed.
What's happening here is terrifying. The destructive forces unleashed could be catastrophic.
At number 5 in the world's strangest disaster zones. On Japan's east coast, there is a confusing picture of deserted buildings and security cordons.
It's apparent that once upon a time, this was a bustling, thriving landscape full of homes, buildings, factories, but now it's just torn apart, destroyed.
There's no question this entire landscape was subjected to an overwhelming force. The whole area looks like some kind of a giant child just tossed it helter-skelter.
But just a few miles away, an altogether different scene emerges.
There's something not quite right about this town. It feels like a zombie movie or like a ghost town.
It's on lockdown. You can't get anywhere near it. The security fences. You are not allowed in this zone. It's a no-go area.
What's happened in this area is so confusing because on the one hand, there's absolute devastation and destruction, and on the other hand, things seem perfectly normal and fine, yet no one is there. The big question for me is, how are those two things linked?
In the town of Tomioka, the local high school now sits vacant and locked up. Little seems to have changed since it was last filled with students.
This is the main school building. There were 3 classes per grade. In total, 9 classes were studying here. Students would play soccer and then baseball around the back. They were training hard.
Toshiko Aoki is a former principal of this school. Having left a few years before disaster struck, she still recalls the promise of its students.
Golf, badminton, soccer. These were the 3 sports the school was focusing on, with the aim of producing athletes that would be successful internationally. The school program was therefore designed around this goal.
But in 2011, those ambitious plans for the future were suddenly put on hold, and the buildings have remained empty ever since. Hanging on the wall is a stark reminder of the exact moment tragedy struck.
Look, this clock on the school building, it stopped at 2:46. The time on the clock hasn't changed since March 11th, 2011.
On that day, at 2:46 p.m., a magnitude 9 earthquake struck the east coast of Japan.
This was one of the most intense earthquakes ever recorded. It lasted for 3 minutes. Usually earthquakes just last for a few seconds.
The earthquake was so powerful that it supposedly moved the entire country of Japan. east by 8 feet. I can't even fathom that.
But while the earthquake caused an evacuation, there was another reason why no one was allowed back.
Well, here's what's amazing about the earthquake itself is it didn't do as much damage as you'd expect. Japan leads the world in earthquake preparedness, and they really plan and build accordingly. So when this earthquake hit, it didn't knock down lots of buildings the way it might have in other parts of the world.
The earthquake, though, was just the beginning. This area was to be hit by not just one, but 2 more deadly events.
The epicenter of the earthquake was 80 miles to the east in the Pacific Ocean. And that set a second devastating event in motion.
When an earthquake happens and its epicenter is at sea, the land shifts. Yeah? And of course, it causes the water above to move. And where is that going to go?
The low-lying lands near the coast were now in the firing line. A tsunami that at its fastest was traveling at 500 miles per hour. It first made landfall around 15 minutes after the earthquake.
Even though they have very high seawalls along this coast, these waves were high enough to crest those walls and flood the coastal plain. A lot of us imagine a big towering breaking wave, but it's really not like that. It's not a single wave. It's more like a flood of water that flows inland and just submerges everything.
When you see the pictures of the water tearing through that landscape, tearing through people's homes and lives, it doesn't matter whether you live 100 miles away or you're on the other side of the globe. On a very human scale, you can actually imagine how terrifying that would be.
In the end, the tsunami reached as far as 6 miles inland, affecting around 200 square miles of the east coast.
The tsunami was devastating. It wiped out the coastal towns, it tore up the infrastructure, and some 19,000 people were killed or missing.
I trained as a civil engineer, and I'm really aware of how we build our buildings and our structures to withstand failure. But in the face of a natural event like that, how can we possibly design to take that into account? It's phenomenal, the amount of power that nature has.
Nearby, new efforts to shore up the coastal defenses are evident. But while these areas are slowly being reclaimed, other sites remain off limits.
So you've got some areas that it's clear there was devastation and destruction, but there are other areas that are just abandoned but look completely normal. There's just no one there, and the only people you can see are security guards.
The fact that there's still security here and guards patrolling the area means that there's still some kind of threat.
So why is this area off limits all these years later? On the 11th of March 2011, a massive earthquake had triggered a tsunami. Sitting directly in the tsunami's path was the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant.
This region got hit really with a triple disaster. First the earthquake, then the tsunami, but third, the tsunami knocked out the local nuclear power plant.
The nuclear plant momentarily vanished behind a cloud of white smoke Saturday. It's not clear how much radiation is leaking from the plant.
The ensuing meltdown caused explosions in reactor unit buildings 1, 2, and 3, allowing dangerous levels of radiation to leak into the atmosphere.
And when those nuclear reactors melted down, that created a release of radioactivity that had an enormous impact on the region.
The government declared a nuclear emergency and the evacuation order was announced.
Initially, only those around a mile away from the plant were affected. But soon, Tomioka and its high school would be swallowed up by the rapidly expanding restricted area.
For people at the time, the earthquake was strong, but the tsunami only really affected the area by the sea. So the next morning, on March 12th, everyone was going to go home and tidy up. But then there was an instruction to leave the city immediately. There was absolutely no time to prepare. People just had to get in their cars and leave.
By the end of that second day, the evacuation zone had stretched to a radius of around 12.5 miles from the plant. But as fears of the radiation spread increased, other areas up to 34 miles away were also evacuated. In total, nearly 200,000 people were removed from their homes.
In reality, from the moment we left the city on March 12th until the 31st of March, 6 years later, the residents of Tomioka weren't allowed back home.
North of Tomioka, cutting through what remains of the off-limits zone today, is Route 6.
Route 6 has to be the weirdest road trip you could ever undertake. You're not allowed to go too many times in one day, and you're not allowed to stop anywhere along that particular part of the route.
The radiation levels are just too high, so you're told to keep your windows up and just keep on going.
There are houses inside, but of course, nobody lives there. There are stores around here, but they've been left completely untouched, the same as they were 8 or 9 years ago.
The nuclear cleanup operation has been the most expensive in history. And gradually, more and more areas, including Tomioka, have reopened. But the consequences of this tragedy are still plain to see.
Contaminated topsoil has had to be removed in order to stop the spread, and you can see across the region large mounds full of this soil. They're trying to contain it.
Mankind doesn't stand still after a disaster, and although it's difficult and expensive to clean up, that's what's happening. And gradually, more and more areas are opening back up with a clean bill of health.
The reason there are so many trucks is because they are carrying decontaminated things and building materials. Either way, it's mainly work vehicles in this area. If the radiation level goes down, the evacuation order in this area will gradually be cancelled. But at the moment, this area is still a no-go zone.
The tsunami claimed thousands of lives. But the fallout from the power plant has left behind a controversial legacy.
The greatest damage from the nuclear accident is not the spread of radiation or the increase in level of radiation, but the people's lives that have been drastically altered. I think that what is really polluted is not the air, but the soul of the people.
The results of this accident are so paradoxical. We think of it as a devastating nuclear release, but the total amounts of radiation were not large enough, according to the World Health Organization and others who've studied it, to cause mass fatalities or potentially any fatalities. But here's the big irony. In a follow-up study, they found out that more than 1,600 people who were evacuated died partly from the stress of the evacuation.
Many of those people were elderly or suffering from medical conditions. And Toshiko is now helping similar people as an advisor for the local support center.
Since the evacuation order was partially cancelled, I moved my residency documentation back. I'm living in Tomioka City now and doing this job. So for the people of Tomioka and for me, the disaster changed our lives.
In Columbia County, Pennsylvania, a whole town appears to have been wiped off the map.
In a way, it's a ghost town without the town.
Roads neatly laid out in a grid suggest this was once a typical American town. Author David de Kock remembers this time well.
The shot was taken in October of 1983, looking up toward the top of town, and you can see there was an entire town there that's now gone.
A freeway with no cars, foundations yet no houses, a police station but no police force.
It's the victim of something that most of us couldn't believe could happen.
Until the 1970s, Centralia was an ordinary American town. But then, people started reporting strange incidents. Dizzying fumes, steaming cracks in the ground, and a local boy narrowly surviving a fall into a sinkhole.
You would see steam coming out of this gigantic highway crack. People wondered what was causing this. They may have thought it was some kind of volcano down there, maybe.
In fact, the ground beneath their feet was on fire, and it's still burning today.
So this is a borehole, and if we unscrew this cap, we're going to see what the fire is like underneath. Ooh, nice and hot. I can smell the distinctive kind of sulfurish smell of the fire.
Centralia sits on a vast network of abandoned coal mines. It's thought a landfill fire found its way into this subterranean labyrinth and began spreading beneath people's homes.
There were citizen groups in Centralia saying, hey, you got to get us out of here. But they still took almost 2 years to come up with a solution.
In 1984, the population of Centralia was relocated and the houses demolished. Today, there is little evidence the community of Centralia ever existed. But one question remains.
So how long could it burn? I've heard figures like 200 years, 250 years, but in the end, nobody really knows. It'll go until it stops burning, runs out of fuel, runs out of air. Neither of those are likely to happen anytime soon.
On the Indonesian island of Java, a perplexing disaster reduced an entire community to a few forsaken structures.
There's homes, there's factories, there's religious shrines, but there's nobody around. It really looks a very strange environment.
There are roads, but they stop at this strange bank that just seems to cut everything off.
It's got warning signs. It's not clear what's on the other side, but clearly something did happen here that has profoundly affected this whole area.
Beyond this barrier, further questions are raised.
So if you can peek over the top, you see the strangest thing, a vast lake of mud. Some parts are still wet and running and bubbling, and other parts have dried and cracked in the sun.
The surface area of the mud is absolutely vast. This goes on as far as the eye can see. It's mind-bendingly large. And the very unnerving thing that creeps up on you as you're looking at it is a sense of questioning, is this still live? Is this finished, or is there still yet more to come?
Closer inspection of this muddy surface, you can actually see things on it and see structures. It's clear that there was something there before, and the mud has now completely draped over everything.
So how did this happen? Was this a natural disaster? Did this happen in a man-made way?
Turns out, in this case, it could be both. But with the site submerged in mud, experts would struggle to prove it. In 2006, Purwong was a flourishing rural area. Muawana once lived here.
This used to be my village, Yesteryears village. It used to be a prosperous village, but now all you can see is the mudflow. We used to live together as a family, but now our relatives are scattered everywhere.
This is the Lumpur Sidoarjo mudflow, also known as Lucy.
This was a buzzing, thriving agricultural area, around 60,000 people. There were fields, there was work to be done, it was a fertile area.
The deluge started without warning on the 29th of May, 2006. Today, the Lucy mudflow coats nearly 6 square miles of Purwong, and it's still growing.
People were running for their lives. They were shouting, "Mudflow, mudflow, mudflow." And then, all of a sudden, it got even bigger.
The mudflow buried 16 villages, 24 factories, and hundreds of paddy fields and commercial fish ponds.
Here, down here, was where the houses, the cemetery, the school, and the mosque used to be. Now everything is buried by the mud.
Muawana and thousands more Purwong residents have been evacuated ever since.
The impact of all of this mud was utter carnage. Some 60,000 people were displaced, their homes just gone, the area unlivable. A gas pipeline was severed, resulting in an explosion that killed 13 people. What had been a very functional agricultural area was now a complete war zone.
I still remember that day. I was running with my children. And now, I just don't know. I'm worried about my children's future. Will I be able to put food on the table? Will I ever get a decent job now? That's what I keep thinking about. I don't know. I'm just fighting for the children.
Something caused an explosion of mud out of the ground. It was jetting up more than 10 meters high into the sky, and it's been measured to have been erupting 180,000 cubic meters of muddy material every day.
At first, the cause of this deadly phenomenon was a mystery.
Economically, it's been incredibly destructive. It's estimated that it's cost about $3 billion in terms of lost infrastructure, and all the efforts to contain this mud lake have failed.
Muawana lived in the town until she and all the other residents were forced to evacuate.
So this is the mud. When it's half dry, you can see all the cracks. But when it's fully dry, it's soft like desert sand. The mud is salty. The salt content is very high. Whoa, yes, that's salty. Very salty. This place used to be full of trees, but now it's like the desert. Vegetation can't grow here anymore.
The mud that's leaking out is not like the mud in your backyard. It's full of various heavy metals, and gas is coming up with it, carbon dioxide and methane, which is also very unhealthy for people. So it's really an environmental catastrophe for the region.
From above, there is little evidence to explain where all this noxious mud is coming from. So why did this catastrophic mudflow start so abruptly?
What's clearly happened here is something extraordinary. People don't just build buildings in and around places where mud's going to spew out of the land.
The mud that drowns this site is bubbling hot. This points towards its source. The complex, ever-shifting tectonics below the 17,000 islands of Indonesia mean that this island chain sits on top of a violent geology.
Indonesia is a lively place geologically. There's earthquakes, there's volcanoes, but people have been living there for thousands of years. This area itself is not necessarily directly affected by volcanoes.
But below Purwong, geothermal heat is pushing a mix of underground water and mud up to the surface, where it erupts as a mud volcano. But the amount of mud coming out of the Lucy mud volcano confounded experts, because it could only come from one place.
The Lucy mud volcano is tapping into a much larger geological phenomenon.
The gases emitted with the Lucy mudflow link it to a large, active volcano system 10 miles away. This system can produce an endless supply of mud that powers through a network of natural tunnels. But this still doesn't explain why the Lucy mudflow suddenly started here.
There's the real question as to whether this is entirely a natural phenomenon, a natural disaster, or is there something else that's gone on, something maybe from a human perspective that's helped to trigger this?
There were suspicions that an oil and gas exploration company drilling in Purwong were to blame.
The process of drilling for natural gas is really very tricky. When you drill down into the earth, you go through layers of rock that keep everything sealed in. You're punching a hole through that rock, and the gas wants to squirt up out of that hole. And anything that's mixed with the gas, water, oil, muck, mud, that will come squirting up as well. The gas itself is under huge pressure. It's like opening a soda bottle, and the way it all comes foaming out.
Some claim that in 2006, below the district of Purwong, the unthinkable happened.
A company drilling an exploratory well for natural gas basically bungled the drilling operation, and that allowed pressurized water and mud to flow up to the surface from deep underground.
The theory is that this drilling, just 200 yards away from the Lucy mud eruption, fractured an old fault system that links Purwong to the active volcano. Now there was no way to stop the deadly flow of mud. But the drilling company pointed to yet another cause.
An earthquake a couple of 100 miles away 2 days before might have opened up a fault or somehow set off this flow of mud.
The drilling company claimed the earthquake created the pressure to reactivate the fault system. Many scientists dispute this possibility. But those whose homes lie buried in mud are in no doubt.
Why did they have to do the drilling in a residential area? Couldn't they have done it somewhere else, in the forest or something, where there are no houses?
Muawana and her neighbors have received a small amount of compensation from the drilling company.
They gave us 20%, and then they said at first that they were going to pay the remaining 80% in cash, but they didn't.
Today, the volcano is still erupting, further coating the surrounding area in mud from the depths of the earth.
The landscape has been fundamentally, radically altered. But actually, at heart, this is a tragic human story. There are people still fighting for compensation.
For the residents of Purwong, life has completely changed since the eruption.
It's completely disrupted people's lives. People have had to move from jobs, from their religious shrines, from everyday life, and be relocated.
With the local economy in ruins, Muawana and her friends now have precious few ways to make a living.
Thanks to tourism, people wanted to come and see this, disaster tourism, they're now able to act as guides to talk people through their experiences, to tell them the story. And so even though it's not what they would have chosen, actually this has now become the source of their new livelihood.
In the heartlands of Argentina, the remains of a town are set within a tortured landscape. A white substance clings to every surface, painting this place in a bleak monochrome hue. And while there appears to be little evidence of what caused such destruction, it is that bleached layer that holds the answers. While most disaster zones lie deserted, this one does not.
I'm Pablo Novak, the only resident left in the ruins. I stayed, and I was sure someone would come back eventually. It used to be so famous. So many people used to come here from all over.
These are the ruins of Via Epecuén. For much of the 20th century, this was a luxurious lakeside retreat.
This was started as the Recreo Almaza, a dance hall. And because the room was small and lots of people came, they also used it for a theatre, with theatre companies coming from Buenos Aires.
The town's main attraction, however, lay beside it, the mineral and salt-rich lake. Famed for its supposed healing powers, no one foresaw its true destructive potential. In 1985, an unprecedented period of rainfall began, and soon the town's flood defenses were overcome.
The floodwaters gradually, slowly consumed the entire town, and by 1993, it was submerged under 30 feet of water, effectively becoming a modern-day Atlantis.
In the decades since, the water has receded, leaving behind the evidence of what occurred.
Everything that you can see now hadn't been seen for 20 years.
And the twist is, this highly saline water left the town covered in a thick layer of salt, giving it this unique appearance.
For Pablo, the town's last resident, the battle to remain continues.
As long as I can walk, talk, and have a good memory, I will stay here.
From silent cataclysms to the violent forces beneath our feet, mystifying natural events and man-made calamities, it appears that humans have made a habit of placing themselves in the firing line. Our final site stands over 800 miles north of the Arctic Circle on the icy shores of Svalbard. Here, immediate peril looms large, but the cause of that danger threatens the entire planet.
Svalbard feels like it's on the edge of the Earth. It is a brutal landscape, cold, barren, and fierce.
In winter, the place is completely covered with snow and in darkness, and in summer you get 24 hours daylight, and so it's a real area of extremes.
The town itself is the world's northernmost settlement of 1,000 people or more. You can't live any farther north than this.
As the seasons change and the snow melts, crumbling ruins appear on the mountainside above the town. But these old wrecks aren't the only deserted structures here.
Most of the town seems to be doing fine and it's populated, but then you have these pockets that are abandoned.
We're used to seeing old abandoned buildings on the brink of collapse, but these buildings look fine.
There's nobody there, and it seems very odd that you've got something that is clearly relatively modern. It's not much has happened to it, but why is nobody living there?
The first clue to what's happening here may be found in those collapsing ruins above.
On the edge of town are these old industrial-looking features, just standing there, forlorn and forgotten. The way these buildings have fallen into this condition makes you wonder if the same fate awaits those modern buildings in town.
A deadly threat hovers over this town, and it could yet have far-reaching consequences.
The issues that are facing this town are quite serious, in fact, potentially deadly. Already, 2 lives have been lost. What's happening here is terrifying. What we're seeing here is the beginnings of something that could soon be beyond our control. And the destructive forces unleashed could be catastrophic.
Svalbard was a distant and perilous place to visit in the 19th century. Over 100 years ago, this land held little value for most.
Originally, the only people who would go to this far northern collection of islands were whalers and people hunting seals. But in 1906, an American named John Longyear came here looking for coal.
Early 20th century, late 19th century, the world is going through changes which are driven by coal. So a resource such as coal found in an area like this is potentially very, very valuable.
The town of Longyearbyen grew on the back of the coal industry. But in the modern world, the luster of coal has diminished, and structures like these have paid the price.
More recently, coal has become a sort of more of a dirty word than something people want. And so the actual scaling back of coal mining globally has happened, but it's also happened in Svalbard.
A slump in the market could mean less demand for housing in the town. But there is more to this story than first meets the eye.
The apartments that have been abandoned, that is not related to the decline of coal. There's a completely different problem there.
These people have been forced out because of a deadly threat to those buildings. With all that mining in the area over the years, you've got to wonder if that's created an issue. Has it destabilized the land somehow?
What danger lurks here? And why have virtually brand new buildings been abandoned to the Arctic tundra? This group of condemned buildings are deemed unsafe by the local authorities.
There's nothing wrong with the building. It's structurally sound. The problem is the location. Something has changed that makes it more dangerous.
It's a terrible feeling to see all these empty buildings standing around and nobody can use them. Nobody lives up here anymore.
Until recently, Nils Lorentzen lived in a similar apartment near here. And he's seen more and more places become off limits to residents.
There are red zones, a lot of places in this area, and a lot of people are affected by these red zones. And it costs the community and people a lot of money. We have a kindergarten. Both my kids went there, and that kindergarten is closed now. It's a sad, sad story.
During the summer months, those apartments are not at risk. But when winter comes, the threat level rises. A few years ago, Nils experienced this firsthand.
I was just leaving my house, and suddenly it was a big bang in the house. And straight away I understood that this was an avalanche, and it was big. It was enormous. It had a lot of speed. I saw in my daughter's bedroom, and I could see straight out her wall because of the building has broke apart.
Nils' apartment can be seen in aerial footage taken before the avalanche struck. But it wasn't the first victim. Other buildings have also been destroyed in recent years.
In 2015, a massive, sudden avalanche hit the town. Imagine a huge sheet of ice, snow, and stone crashing into these houses with such force that it literally lifted them up and deposited them across the street.
It soon emerged that 8 people had been injured and 2 people had been killed.
Nobody believed that it could be so large avalanches that could hit the houses and kill people, and I think nobody thought that could happen.
While avalanche barriers stand above the town today, for those hollowed-out apartments, the risks are just too great.
The danger that those other apartments faced in recent years, this place now faces that same threat.
Come winter, they'll be right in the firing line. And the order has come down to completely evacuate and demolish this place.
Today, it's not only those apartments that lie inside this red zone. These structures weren't built in a dangerous location. The location has become dangerous. So what caused this? These collapsing structures on the outskirts of town hold the answers. And there's a startling conclusion being drawn.
The irony here is that the very industry that built this community also endangers it. And that's the process of mining and burning coal, which releases so much carbon dioxide into the atmosphere that ultimately it starts to warm the planet.
At the local university, glaciologist Heidi Silvestre has been studying the changes affecting Svalbard.
The black curve is the changes in temperatures globally for the past 120 years, and the orange curve is the changes in temperatures in Svalbard. When we look at what's happening for the past 2 or 3 decades, there the temperatures really diverge, and we see the temperatures in Svalbard increase twice as fast as the rest of the world.
Since 1971, on average, temperatures here have risen by 4 degrees Celsius. This is the fastest warming place on Earth.
It's like an exaggerated version of global warming, if you will, but it has deadly consequences, and it's really changing the local environment, and the people living there have to dramatically change their lifestyles to cope with it.
For the homes that have been lost already, and for those now in the firing line, this drastic temperature change has made large avalanches a very real threat.
Today we can absolutely draw a link between climate change and the 2015 avalanche. And unfortunately, our predictions define that there will be more and more events like this in the future.
Today, avalanches are not the only consequence of climate change facing Svalbard. Its glaciers are rapidly receding, and the archipelago's seas no longer freeze in winter. The location may be remote, but these alarming events are a warning to us all.
Arctic regions like this are kind of like the canary in the coal mine. Whatever is happening to the whole planet is going to happen faster here because the weather there is so extreme in the first place.
It's human nature not to appreciate the scale of danger until it's right in front of us, until the catastrophe is actually happening. And if you wait until the snow and ice is sliding down the mountain towards you, it's already too late.
From Earth's violent tectonic forces to man-made calamities, disaster zones across our planet remind us of nature's awesome power and the perils of underestimating it. But they also bear testament to humankind's ability to adapt, thrive, and overcome.